Most people walk through life wearing a mask of niceness, conditioned from childhood to believe that being agreeable and putting others first is the path to love, acceptance, and belonging. But what's not taught is the invisible cost of constantly people-pleasing, the loss of one's authentic self, the chronic anxiety of needing approval, and the slow erosion of boundaries that leads to resentment, burnout, and disconnection from others and oneself. And as we explore how to quit this cycle, we need to begin with understanding where this deep-seated compulsion comes from, often rooted in early environments where love was conditional, where parents rewarded compliance and discouraged emotional expression, subtly teaching the child that their needs and feelings were secondary to the comfort or expectations of others. And this formative training becomes a script that gets repeated in adult relationships, leading us to suppress opinions, say yes when we mean no, and fear that setting boundaries will make us unlovable or selfish. And this internalized belief system becomes like a cage we don't even realize we're in. And before we can quit pleasing everyone, we must first become aware of the moments we do it, starting with our body's cues: tension in the jaw, anxiety in the chest, a sinking feeling in the stomach when asked to do something we don't want to do. And instead of ignoring those signs, we must treat them as valuable messengers telling us where we are betraying ourselves to maintain harmony or avoid conflict. And we need to get honest about the emotional payoff of people-pleasing, which is often the illusion of safety and control. If others are happy with us, we think we're safe from rejection, abandonment, or criticism. But this safety is a false one, because it comes at the cost of being truly known, and intimacy requires being known, which cannot happen if we are constantly shape-shifting to match other people's expectations. So the first step to building real intimacy is radical self-honesty, acknowledging when we're being performative, when we're shrinking ourselves, when we're making choices out of fear instead of desire, and beginning to ask ourselves what we truly want in a given situation, not what we think will keep the peace or earn approval. And though this can feel terrifying at first, especially if you're used to measuring your worth by how useful or agreeable you are, the more you practice listening to your authentic voice and expressing it even in small ways, the more you begin to reclaim your agency, and the less dependent you become on external validation to feel okay. And this shift is where the foundation of true intimacy begins, not with others, but with yourself. And as you build that inner intimacy, you start to attract relationships that are based on authenticity rather than performance. And the people who can't handle the real you may fall away, which is painful but also clarifying. Because intimacy is not about being liked by everyone. It's about being known by a few, deeply and truly, and being willing to risk disapproval in order to be loved for who you really are, not who you pretend to be. And that requires courage, but it also brings liberation. And the first taste of that freedom is addictive. Because once you've experienced what it feels like to be loved without the mask, it becomes increasingly difficult to go back to living a life of approval chasing and self-denial. And quitting people-pleasing is not about becoming rude or selfish, but about becoming honest, integrated, and whole, which is the only real foundation for intimacy. And in this process, the goal is not to stop caring about others, but to start including yourself in the circle of care, to give yourself the same kindness, permission, and respect that you so readily give to others. And this internal alignment is what allows for intimacy to grow. Not the illusion of harmony that comes from people-pleasing, but the messy, beautiful, honest connection that comes from showing up as you truly are. As we move deeper into this journey of shedding the compulsive need to please others and moving toward real intimacy, it becomes essential to examine the psychological mechanisms that keep us stuck in this pattern, like the inner critic who whispers that we are selfish or bad for asserting ourselves, or the trauma responses, fawn, freeze, flight, that we default to when faced with potential conflict or disappointment, and in particular, the fawn response, which is the nervous system's strategy of appeasing others to avoid threat, is especially relevant for chronic people pleasers, and learning to recognize this in our behavior is critical, because until we can name it, we can't change it. And so we begin to ask new questions. Where in my life am I saying yes to things that drain me? Where am I avoiding difficult conversations out of fear of being disliked? Where am I choosing short-term comfort over long-term alignment with my values and truth? And as these questions start to unearth the hidden ways we abandon ourselves daily, the next step is learning how to set boundaries, not just as a self-help buzzword, but as an act of love, a declaration that says, this is who I am, this is what I need, and this is what I will no longer tolerate. And yes, boundaries may disappoint others, but they also protect our energy, dignity, and ability to connect authentically. And though it may feel unnatural or even cruel to assert a limit, especially if you were raised in environments where boundaries were violated or ignored, this discomfort is a sign that you're growing, not that you're doing something wrong. And in fact, discomfort is the bridge between your old identity as a people pleaser and your emerging self as a whole, honest person capable of real intimacy, because intimacy cannot grow in the soil of resentment. And every time we say yes, when we mean no, we plant the seeds of resentment, which eventually poison the relationship we were trying to protect. So, boundaries are not barriers to connection. They are its foundation, and learning to communicate them clearly and compassionately, without over-explaining or apologizing, is a powerful act of self-respect. And part of this practice is learning to tolerate the feelings that arise when others are disappointed or uncomfortable, which is hard but necessary, because if we can't tolerate others' disapproval, we will always be held hostage by their opinions, and we will never be free to live our own truth. And as we grow in this capacity, we begin to experience a new kind of relationship dynamic, one that is not based on managing perceptions or keeping everyone happy, but on mutual respect, emotional honesty, and the willingness to be seen as we are. And this shift may initially lead to fewer relationships, but the ones that remain or emerge will be richer, deeper, and more nourishing, because they will be rooted in who you truly are, not who you pretended to be to keep the peace. And as this pattern stabilizes, you begin to rewrite the narrative of your life, not as someone who exists to serve others at the expense of yourself, but as someone who shows up whole and invites others to do the same. And this invitation, this energy of authenticity, is magnetic, because true intimacy is not about perfection, but about presence. And when you are present with yourself and others, without masks or manipulation, you create space for connection that is real, reciprocal, and resilient. And in that space, love grows, not the conditional kind that depends on your performance, but the unconditional kind that meets you where you are, embraces your humanity, and honors your boundaries. And that is the love you've been longing for all along, not the fleeting approval of everyone, but the steady acceptance of a few, and most importantly, yourself. And when the soul tires of performing on the endless stage of others' expectations, Zen invites us to return to the silence that reveals who we truly are beneath the layers of obligation and people-pleasing. You may have lived so long, bending and shaping your voice, your time, your very presence around what others want, that you no longer know what you want. And that is the first wound of disconnection. When pleasing others becomes your default state, even the kindest gestures come from fear. Fear of rejection, of abandonment, of not being enough. Zen doesn't condemn kindness, but it cautions against kindness without roots, without center. To say no is not cruelty. It is clarity. To honor your needs is not selfish, it is sacred responsibility. In this practice, we begin to walk backwards out of the tangled forest of chronic compliance, shedding one false self at a time. What emerges is not arrogance, but a quiet authenticity, the kind that breathes and moves with ease. It may feel uncomfortable at first. Those around you might notice the change. Some may resent it. Others may misunderstand it. But the truest ones will begin to see you more clearly and love you more deeply, not for how well you serve them, but for how fully you show up as yourself. The intimacy you've been longing for does not arise from being agreeable. It arises when your heart feels safe to be fully seen, even in its imperfections, even when it trembles. Zen tells us to stop running from ourselves. Stop seeking love at the cost of your wholeness. Drop the mask, even if your hands shake. Come back to the breath, to the soft knowing of presence. Watch a flower. It does not bloom to please the bee, yet it is loved for exactly what it is. So too with you. Your healing begins, not when others understand your boundaries, but when you keep them anyway. Not when you finally become who they want, but when you remain rooted in who you are. Slowly you reclaim your voice, your stillness, your peace. Slowly your life becomes not a performance, but a practice. And in that sacred practice of being, you rediscover what intimacy really means. Not being everything for everyone, but being wholly yourself, with someone who sees that as enough. Let your spirit exhale. Release the pressure to impress, to fix, to win approval. What remains when the noise falls away is the gentle truth of your being, already worthy, already lovable, already enough. And now that you have begun to breathe again, to move without the invisible chains of approval seeking, you can finally feel the full space of your own presence. In Zen, we learn that intimacy begins not in another's gaze, but in the quiet recognition of the self that no longer begs to be validated. This final stage of release asks for courage. Not the loud, performative courage the world praises, but the quiet kind, the courage to be misunderstood, to let people down when their comfort depends on your self-betrayal, to stand in your truth even when your knees shake. To quit pleasing everyone is not to abandon compassion. It is to allow compassion to begin at home. You are no longer a shapeshifter, a mirror of other people's moods and preferences. You are a still lake, clear enough to reflect the sky, but rooted enough not to be disturbed by every ripple. True intimacy arises not when we mold ourselves into who we think others want, but when we are fully alive and honest, when our yes means yes, and our no is no. The fear of being alone, of being rejected, of being unliked, fades with each act of self-honoring. Zen teaches us that our attachment to outcomes, especially how others perceive us, is a veil over the simple beauty of presence. When we let go of the need to please, we begin to see relationships not as lifelines for validation, but as mirrors for growth, containers for authenticity. The people who remain when you are no longer performing, they are your sangha, your true companions. And the ones who fall away were never seeing you, only the mask. Breathe into that grief if it arises, for it is holy. Let go of trying to explain yourself. Let silence speak where words once begged. The path of Zen is not about becoming likable. It is about becoming real. When you practice letting others sit with their own discomfort, not rushing to fix, to rescue, to please, you return responsibility to where it belongs. You become free. Free to listen more than defend. Free to love without attachment. Free to walk away when your soul whispers enough. In this freedom, intimacy blooms, not just with others, but with life itself. You find peace in your solitude, strength in your honesty, and grace in your boundaries. And so, let this journey toward true intimacy begin and end with you, not in isolation, but in presence, not in armor, but in awareness. You are no longer here to prove your worth through sacrifice. You are here to live, to love, to let go. There is no one to become. There is only the shedding of everything you are not. As the Zen masters say, when I let go of who I am, I become what I might be. And that becoming, begins now. One breath, one truth, one gentle refusal to abandon yourself ever again. If this message brought you calm, this space is always here for you. Subscribe, return, and walk this quiet path with us, one breath at a time. Until next time, remember, do not look for a sanctuary in anyone except yourself.